Welcome to Alge's Investment Podcast. And in this episode, we're going to talk about whiskey. And all the way from Singapore, we got Ross Eva, who heads up the whiskey department for Bordeaux Index. Ross, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be here. We've been wanted to do this for a while now.
So it's taken a while. It's taken a while. So my first question for you, for all of us who know very little about whiskey, is what on earth is a malt whiskey? And then secondly, how do you make it?
Sure. So a single malt whiskey is a malt whiskey that is produced at a single distillery. So hence single malt being from a single distillery. It's made very simply with 3 ingredients. So barley, water and yeast, effectively. Your barley is taken, it's soaked, allowed to germinate and then dried. You then grind that up and add hot water to it. You then have what's called a sugary water called wort. And then you add yeast to that to create your alcohol, your wash. So it's kind of like a beer you're making. That liquid is then distilled in a copper still up to around sort of 65, 70% ABV.
And ABV stands for?
It's the alcohol content.
Okay.
So if you think of a bottle of wine, 13%, the distilleries are making a spirit or a make that is around 65, 70%. So very strong, clear liquid. It's not, it smells interesting, but it's not something perhaps for sort of human regular consumption at least. That liquid is then put into a wooden oak cask and left to age and mature. After 3 years, you can legally call it single malt whiskey, but it gathers value over time. So really, you want to be aging it far beyond that 3 years.
And for all our listeners, what we really want to know is whiskey an investment, or is it just another asset that enthusiasts love to collect?
So the simple answer, the easy answer is it's a bit of both, but one sort of feeds the other. So, whiskey is obviously appealing to collectors. We're human beings. We love to collect. We love to collect cars. We love to collect bottles of wine. We love to collect art if we're fortunate enough to be able to do so. That is the same for whiskey. And so you have great collectors of whiskey all over the world who will have fine bottles from Scotland, Japan, the USA. I've been fortunate enough to visit a lot of collectors and seen their cellars, and they have great whiskey rooms where they display their bottles like pieces of art. Now, of course, every time that a consumer is buying those whiskies and hopefully drinking them as well, it increases the value of the stock that remains in the market. So particularly if you have a single cask bottling, that is to say a whiskey from one single barrel, that's likely to only be around 200 bottles or so. Each time a bottle is purchased and drunk, that will naturally reduce the amount of stock on the market. And the same goes for casks as well.
And time horizon is always very important for investing or collecting. What is the time horizon that investors or collectors should really be considering owning their chosen whiskey for, to give it time to actually mature, but also potentially beat inflation?
Sure. We would advise that whiskey needs to be looked at from an investment perspective as something you would hold for 5 to 10 years, realistically, to do that. Yeah.
The whiskey market looked to me as a novice to have peaked last year, I did notice that a single bottle of 1929 Macallan sold for $2.7 million. Now, was that the calling at the top of the market, or will we ever see those sort of prices again?
So it's a great question, and I think we could look to historical trends to sort of see that whiskey has continued to age, to improve in value very strongly over time. So over the last decade or so, just over a decade, we've found that compound annual growth rate of around 20% for whiskies, collectible whiskies and casks in general. Now, last year, yes, you could say that there was a peak, particularly after the COVID super cycle where everyone was at home,
of course,
a bit more cash. It encouraged more people to come to the market. And so, yes, you did see some incredible figures last year. Will we see them again? I think we'll see them in a different way. So I think the market, when we go through plateaus, when it comes back in a different way. So I think we will start to see things like casks being sold more frequently to clients. So it will come back, but perhaps in a different way than before.
So in some ways, whiskey sounds like a luxury brand.
Mm-hmm.
Are there luxury brands that are getting involved in whiskey today that simply were not there 10, 15 years ago?
Well, they've been there for a while, but I think increasingly you've seen many luxury brands getting involved in whiskey and looking at it in the same way they'd look at other products within their portfolio. So a Louis Vuitton may release a handbag every year and increase the price by 10% year on year. That sort of model's starting to apply to whiskey and to the wine world as well by some of these major fashion brands.
So LVMH, who else is involved in the whiskey?
So LVMH, Chanel. You have obviously Louis Vuitton incorporates many different sort of brands, and Moet Hennessy have incorporated with them as well. So yeah, it's and the smaller ones as well.
From an investor's perspective, what are the best whiskies to own? Are they Scottish? Are they Japanese? Should you be going to a particular region within Scotland? How do you basically filter down to where you should be looking as an investor?
Sure. So my background was predominantly from the wine world before I moved more into whiskey around 10 years ago. I know wine's something that you're very passionate about as well, Algie. I often try and find ways to calibrate ways between the wine market and the whiskey market, just to make it a little bit easier for me. And because a lot of people I know come from wine and get into whiskey that way. So wine is always a little bit more straightforward when you get into it. You have Bordeaux and you have the first growths. Mm-hmm. So for me, I'm looking for those distilleries that are the equivalent of being a first growth, i.e. those are the major brands that are universally loved and admired and collected by whiskey lovers all over the world. So we're talking about Macallan, Dalmore, Springbank, Ardbeg, Balvenie, Glenfiddich, Glenfarclas. I mean, there'll be more that I've forgotten and I'll be told off about. But
they're some of the examples of some of the major ones.
Yes. Now regions aren't quite so important as they are in wine, but those are the distilleries that we look at, I think.
And of course, you work for Bordeaux Index. I'm going to ask a cheeky question here.
Sure.
What percentage of Bordeaux Index's turnover does whiskey represent?
Well, you may maybe get me in trouble, but it's around, last year it was around 20%.
20%?
20% of our business, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what percentage of the UK wine market do you think Bordeaux Index represents in terms of its turnover?
So I ballpark it, but I'd say between 10 and 20% of the fine wine whiskey market, yeah.
And is the whiskey market growing? So you said 20%. Mm. What was it 5 years ago, and what do you expect it's going to be in 5 years' time?
So it's what's happening. What we're seeing in the whiskey market is a growth in demand for the very finest and oldest whiskies, but that's been met with a strategic imbalance, a shallowness of stock that exists in the market. You have to remember that single malt whiskey is a relatively new entry to the whiskey world. The distilleries have been around for hundreds of years. However, they were principally concerned with producing whiskey to sell to blender bottlers, what would be the modern day equivalent of Diageo. So you'd have your Macallans and Glenfiddichs and Kalilas. They would be producing whiskey they'd then sell to a blender to produce things like Johnny Walker or Chivas Regal. Now, it was only in the 1960s when Glenfiddich really sort of came along and said, we're going to do everything in-house, and hence created the single malt whiskey, i.e. whiskey that's produced and bottled on site, that single malt was created. So relatively new category by those standards. But particularly if you think about, if you want to produce a 50-year-old whiskey, you've got to wait 50. You've got to be laying down a barrel now that's going to be ready for 50 years' time. Now, of course, back then they could never have known what the demand would have been. And there were particular sort of challenges the whiskey market went through in the 70s and 80s. So what we're finding now is more and more consumers worldwide are asking for these great old whiskies, but the distilleries simply do not have a sufficient amount of stock to be able to satisfy that. So production is running 24/7. You drive. I've just come from Speyside the last couple of days, and you drive through whiskey country. The stills are running 24/7, 24 hours, 7 days a week. They're running the spirit. That hasn't really changed. Like the level of production hasn't really changed. What has changed is these distilleries are putting the liquid into barrel and leaving it to age for longer. So the warehouse space is increasing. You know, some of these are expecting to double their warehouse capacity over the next 5-10 years to satisfy that future demand. I think that's what's really interesting for the whiskey market.
And just to get back to my original question, what do you expect the whiskey department at Bordeaux Index to represent within your turnover? In 5 years' time, is it going to be 20%?
My ambition is for it to match wine, so 50-50. That's where I like it to go. That's where I think it can go.
Wow! Yeah. And now going back to the investor, with wine, I've always known that you've got to be very patient to have an inflation-beating return, and 10 years is a sensible time horizon. But when does whiskey's price sort of go up the most? Is it in the first 10 years? Is it in the second decade or the third decade?
Well, if we're looking at casks, which I think this is probably the easiest thing for us to answer this question by, there's still a lot of there's not a lot of transparent information out there, but the information we do have suggests that the inflection points come after 3 years, so when a whiskey can officially be called single malt whiskey.
Yes.
And then it's around 5 and then 8 years. Now, if you were to look at your shelf of whiskey in a fine wine merchant, you will see a 15-year-old, 18-year-old, 21, 25, 30. So those tend to be sort of followed by the casks when they sort of get more valuable, let's say. So certainly a 39-year-old cask of whiskey won't be as valuable as a 40-year-old barrel of whiskey.
Okay.
Yeah.
How should investors go about buying whiskey? How do they do it?
Yeah. So you need to be working with a trusted advisor. This is still a very nascent market, particularly on the cask space. I got into the whiskey side of the business because I saw a lot of similarities to the wine market 10, 15 years ago, where wine investment was really becoming more of a thing. And now it's very much, part of the landscape. And if you are someone who's interested in investing in wine, it's very quick to be able to go onto the internet and find a price that you feel comfortable with, a merchant that you feel you can trust. For whiskey, it's not quite there yet. It's still quite nascent in that way. So you need to be dealing with someone who has a good track record, someone you trust, and also someone who has a route to market, because ultimately if you are looking for resale, you need someone who's going to be able to help you resell. So a global route to market, a global network of clients.
I think that's key, actually, a global route to market.
Yeah.
Now, is it better to own bottles or casks?
No.
I mean, bottles seem attractive, but maybe casks are the better thing to own.
It's a really good question. I think, again, the cop-out answer is it's a bit of both, really. I mean, with whiskey bottles, there is the added bonus, if you like. You know, as I say, if you see great whiskey collectors, they have rooms dedicated to their collections where they display these beautiful ornate bottles with incredible labels and ornate decanters. There's something really quite thrilling about that tangibility. It's only something you don't get necessarily with wine, which you have to store very carefully, typically in temperature-controlled storage. Whiskey, you can afford to be a little bit more fun with in that way. So for bottles, that's really what you're looking at. And so you're probably better to steer towards the single cask bottlings, the limited editions from the top distilleries, bottles that are limited to 200, 250 bottles in a single run. Cask is a little bit different because you're buying a cask really to, if it's for an investment, you're buying a cask to hold for a 5-10 year period. It's not something necessarily you're going to want to bottle yourself. You perhaps want to resell it as is. So it's a different.
So say someone buys a cask. Mm-hmm. What's it going to cost them to ensure that and to keep it in storage?
Sure. So storage rates vary depending on the warehouse.
Yes.
Well, typically they run about £60 per cask per year.
Okay.
Insurance currently is around about 0.4, 0.5% of the purchase value.
Okay. Cheeky question here. What's the highest price you've ever sold a cask of whiskey for?
Well, me personally, I was fortunate enough to sell a very special cask for £6 million a couple of years ago to a private client in Asia. It was a fabulous cask, 50 years old, from one of the very top distilleries out of Speyside.
Wow! And was the cask actually held at the distillery in Speyside that produced it, or was it held at a different warehouse?
It was from the distillery itself. So the distillery had held this cask for 50 years, and then the condition was if the client was to buy it, they'd have to bottle it then. So the distillery wasn't prepared to let the client hold it for another 5-10 years.
Yeah, okay.
So if you want it, you buy it.
But
the packaging was stupendous.
So. And we've already touched on what ABV stands for, the alcohol content. Yeah. But surely the alcohol content over time drops in a cask.
It does, yeah.
And that therefore at some point in time the alcohol content gets to a level whereby buyers shouldn't be considering the purchase of it. What is the alcohol content rule of thumb for you in terms of when to purchase and when to sell? Sure.
So perhaps helpful just to dial it back to, as we said, when you make a single malt whiskey, you're putting a alcoholic spirit that's around 65% ABV into the barrel. Every year, the volume and the ABV will decrease over time. It's what we call the angel share.
The angel share.
Yes. So we don't quite know how what rate it's going to evaporate. That's down to the angels.
Yeah.
So it's a very romantic Scottish term. So now, obviously, if you were to look on just your regular sort of shelf of whiskey at a merchant's, you'll see ABV rates range between sort of 40 to 50% generally. They can be higher, but that's the sort of general sort of sweet spot. Now, if it's for investment, you want to ideally be getting a whiskey that's got a high ABV, because that will indicate that it's got longer left to mature.
Yes, okay.
But once it goes below 40%, it can no longer be called single malt Scotch. So that's really the point of no return. So you really want to be thinking about exiting bottling long before that.
Now, a little bit of a technical question here possibly, but is the value? I mean, say you said to me there's 200 bottles in a cask. We'll go into more detail in a second. But if someone is selling their cask of whiskey, what is the discount that they sell it at versus what the bottler will sell the end product once it's been bottled? because there must be a difference between the cask price per litre and
Sure.
the bottle price per litre.
Yes. Okay. So again, it can vary.
I mean, a rule of thumb.
It can vary, and obviously you have to factor in things like packaging. If you were just going to do a simple, elegant bottle compared to an ornate crystal decanter, but I think realistically you've got to be looking at 20%. That's really where you want to be. That in terms of that discount, once you factor in the bottling margin, that's really sort of minimum to make it interesting.
And what is the level of commission that investors need to accept? I mean, in the wine world, it's about 10%.
Sure.
Or it used to be until you guys came on board and crushed it down to about 3%. But what is the level of commission that people should expect to be a fair level of commission to pay the agent? So
at Bordeaux Index, it's 10%. That's what we charge on whiskey resale, on casks and on bottles. That's 10%.
What is the most popular whiskey out there in terms of the region where it's produced? I mean, is it Scottish whiskey? And within Scotland, is there an area which is the most popular at the moment, or is it Japanese or American whiskey?
It would still be Scotch. It would still be Scotch whiskey. Japanese whiskey is tremendously popular, but productions is a lot lower than it would be in Scotland. So Scotland's still number one. Yeah.
And of the volume of whiskey that you have sold over the last year, what percentage of that is to Asia?
It's a really good question. The lion's share is to Asia. So I'd say well over half.
Well over half.
60%, yeah.
And for the Asian consumer, what's their favourite mixer to put in with their single malt whiskey?
It's a really good question. The classic whiskey cocktail is the highball, very much sort of pioneered in Japan. So very simply, it's a dram of whiskey, dram of Scotch or Japanese whiskey, lots of ice and soda water, and simple as that. Very refreshing, very nice in the Singapore climate. Yeah.
Now, a naive question here also, but going back to casks, there must be different cask sizes. Could you explain the different sizes of casks and also the wood origins that they're made from?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So all casks are made from oak. The two classic sizes that you get would be what we call hogsheads and butts. The hogsheads are around 250 litres and butts are about double that, so about 500 litres. The majority of casks come from the United States, and they would have held bourbon in them before. And bourbon's great for putting in for a small period of time to soak up a lot of that very sort of initial intense flavours from the oak. So by the time it reaches Scotland, it's much more sort of mellow, and that harshness has been drawn out by the initial exposure to the bourbon.
Why is Islay such a popular area of whiskey production? Is it the water?
Well, water's key everywhere. I mean, I've just been in Speyside, and you can just see the quality of water there, and the number of fishermen on the banks to sort of prove just how wonderful the water is. But it's no different in Islay. I think firstly you should say that Islay is just a stunningly beautiful place. It's the beauty is completely arresting. So I'm hopefully one day we'll get to go together, because I'd love to show you.
I'll hold you to that.
Yes, no problem. I'd love to take you. The Islay is really renowned for making the peated whiskies. It's not exclusive. The whiskies there are not exclusively peated, but that's where you get access to these great sort of reserves of peat that creates this wonderful smoky style of whiskey. There's only around 8 distilleries, 8 or 9 distilleries on Islay. There's more to open. There's some that have reopened, such as Port Ellen. It's a difficult island to get to. Weather frequently means that the airport is out of commission. So to get there is a bit of a labour of love, and to get whiskey off the island is even harder still. So it's a bit of romance. It's that great peated whiskey. It's that romance. It's the beauty of the island. That's really what makes it. But it only accounts for about 5% of the total outturn of Scotch whiskey in Scotland. So very low production.
So that is fascinating. So there I am, and I've used Bordeaux Index or another reputable company to buy my cask of whiskey. Does it matter that the cask that I buy is not warehoused in the distillery where it was made?
Not at all. No, it doesn't. It doesn't matter. Ultimately, what we're dealing with here in terms of the storage of the whiskies, we're dealing with a highly regulated market on the storage side. So each cask of whiskey is registered with HMRC. So every time that a cask is moved, it's then registered with HMRC. So you have that sort of backstop of security with that in mind.
So then I got my cask of whiskey, and then am I allowed to taste it?
Of course, yes, absolutely.
And so, how do you get someone to tap a bit out, or whatever the expression is?
So we call it regauging.
Regauging.
Yes. So. And it's something that we at Bordeaux Index we like to do regularly. It's not good to be going in and out of the cask every day, but once at least sort of twice once every 2 years we would look to go into the cask, do a regauge, draw a sample, check the ABV, check the volume of the cask to assess how much the evaporation has affected it, and of course the taste as well, which we would share with our clients as well.
And if the evaporation level is worryingly high, is there anything you can do to arrest that evaporation rate?
There is, yes. And actually, when I was just in Scotland, had the chance to try a cask that had been moved into a new cask, a smaller cask. So basically, you want to try and keep that surface area of wood to whiskey within that sweet spot. If it gets too high, if there's too much sort of oxygen allowed to get into the barrel, then you're going to just that rate will increase.
Yes,
so you can we would what we call re-rack.
You can re-rack it,
the liquid into a smaller barrel. Yeah.
And then I as the owner of the cask, what would you send me a 70 cl bottle of whiskey to
sure,
or do you have smaller samples?
We tend to draw off about 10 cl.
10 cl.
Yeah, that means that we draw off a small amount ourselves, not for our Christmas parties, but really for us as experts to assess the taste of it, to sort of say, well, actually it's because even if the alcohol is high and the volume's still high, you want to make sure that the liquid's integrating with the wood nicely. So that's what we would do. And then we'd send the balance to you.
And then who are the best independent bottlers? Because if you've got a cask and eventually you decide to sell it, you might sell it to another private purchaser, or from what I understand, you might sell it to a bottler.
Sure. Yeah. That can be an option. So the oldest and the ones with the greatest reputation, Gordon MacPhail, regarded as being the godfathers of single malt whiskey, Douglas Ling, Signatory. These are establishments that have been around for many years.
For many years,
yeah.
And so it doesn't matter then that the whiskey isn't bottled by the distillery that it came from.
No, not necessarily. And indeed, if you were to buy let's say a Macallan bottled by Gordon MacPhail, whiskey collectors would recognise that as being potentially some of the finest Macallan you would be likely to find, certainly outside of the distillery. And in fact, we know a number of distilleries that buy back casks from independent bottlers because they know they've looked after them so well.
And just going back in history, these old casks that have got into the marketplace that are no longer at the distilleries, did the distilleries get in trouble in the 1970s financially and need to sell off their stock? What was the catalyst for this to happen?
Sure. So you had as I say, single malt really became a category in the 1960s with Glenfiddich. Other distilleries followed suit, but you had a downturn as happens in markets in the 70s and 80s that meant that distilleries had to sell their stock to stay afloat. In some cases, distilleries were mothballed, closed down for a period of time, laid silent.
And as a buyer of whiskey, say I got very lucky and I bought a good whiskey, and it had gone up substantially in value, and I sold it. Am I liable to pay any tax on that at time of purchase or at time of sale?
So the sale is conducted under bond, but we would always say on matters of tax, it's better to speak to a trusted tax advisor on such matters.
Okay, yeah. But at the moment, what is the HMRC's view on whiskey? Is it a perishable item or I mean, is it treated the same as wine?
Yes, at the moment, yes, yeah. But again, it's we would always advise on tax matters to speak to a trusted advisor.
Absolutely,
specialist on that. Yeah.
I think that's really important to get that point across. Actually,
absolutely.
So, if you had £1,000 today, and you wanted to buy yourself something really special, what would you be buying today as a whiskey that could potentially turn out to be an investment?
I'm going to cheat here a little bit and give two answers. Okay. So one is I have one for me and perhaps one for the seller. So I would say one of my epiphany moments, we have them in wine, we have them in whiskey as well, was Yamazaki 18. And I first tried this 10, 15 years ago with friends and from the trade, including a good friend who's Scottish. And I remember when we opened it, he was very sort of dismissive of it. But when we tried it, it was really just this light bulb moment where you're like, wow, this is unlike anything I've tasted before. So that holds a special place in my heart. So Yamazaki 18, it's a lot more expensive than it was 15 years ago, but that would still be something for me. But for something to potentially lay down, I always like the Glenfarclas family casks. So these are limited single cask bottlings from Glenfarclas, one of the great Speyside producers, sherry cask almost exclusively. You can't go wrong. And the prices are really fantastic. So.
And what about if I had £10,000?
So for me, I really love the Balvenie 40-year-old. I've got a soft spot in my heart for Balvenie. Another Speyside distillery. It's got those lovely classic Balvenie honeyed notes, some of those floral characters as well. It's a robust spirit, but I just love that. I love that whiskey, and I think that brand's got, I just feel it's got a real growth story.
It's got a real runway ahead of it.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And then, so we're at bottles so far. Mm-hmm. Let's test you.
Yeah.
Okay. How about £1 million invested into whiskey? Are we now at a point when people are you'd be thinking about buying casks?
Sure.
And what casks and what age would you be buying?
Well, I think it's important to look to, really, firstly, you want to be looking for something that interests you, I think. Same with wine. If you have an interest in it, that's going to help. Most people tend to be interested in the top whiskey, so your Macallans, Springbanks, Dalmoors. Of course, it's much harder to get access to these crown jewels than it ever was. So those distilleries that we'd say perhaps be the second growths would also be particularly interesting as well. Distilleries with runways to grow further.
What age would those whiskies be that you'd be putting into that portfolio? I
wouldn't necessarily think about the age, but I'd think about the volume and the alcohol content that remains in the cask. So ideally, a cask still have a high volume and high ABV, and that can be a cask that's 5 years old. You can still have casks that are 20, 30 years old, if you're lucky, that have that runway to still mature further for another 10, 20 years. So I'd look at the volume and the ABV rather than the age.
And as long as that ABV is above 50% or
pretty much, yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really fascinating. Now, drinking neat whiskey, for most of us, doesn't taste too good. So how on earth do you go about tasting whiskey? What is the right way of tasting whiskey?
Sure. So it's similar in many ways to wine, I think. You're looking at the color first. Is it a golden color? Is it more of a sort of pale straw yellow? You're looking at the legs, how, the alcohol content and how slowly those legs drip down the side of the Glencairn glass, the same way with wine. You want to nose it, but perhaps come back to it once or twice. It'd be nice if we had a dram here.
I know, it's just, unfortunately, this podcast is at 9 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, we'll come back and do one later, but when the cameras aren't rolling. Nose it once or twice. Just to, not perhaps don't put your nose all the way in, because you might sort of dull your senses with the strength of the alcohol, but go back once or twice. Try and look for extra sort of layers. Try and get a bit more oxygen into the glass too, in the same way you would for wine, to open it up. Taste. Swirl it all around the mouth. Perhaps only need a drop, not a mouthful like you would do for wine, but a drop. Swirl it all around the mouth. Spit or drink as your choice. Then you're going to want to go back and add a drop of water and see how that opens it up. So just 1 or 2 drops with a pipette into the whiskey.
Literally just drops.
Just a little drop. Yeah. And that can just do wonders in some cases to really sort of open up the expressiveness of the whiskey. And then just go through exactly the same again. Nose, palate, and you can sometimes see the changes are incredible. And
then you repeat that another drop.
Normally just one time with a
time.
drop. But again, your choice. If you want to add a little bit more, entirely up to you. It can be even more interesting if you do that, for sure.
Now, in the same way as wine gets corked, can whiskey go off?
It shouldn't do. So, I mean, you are dealing with a natural product as a stopper, so there is always a risk, but it's far more infrequent than it is far less frequent than it is for wine. But you're going to want it sealed, keep it sealed, and keep it in a consistent temperatures, ideally away from fluctuations in heat and out of sort of direct sunlight. It doesn't need to have the sort of cellar-like temperatures that wine faces, but really you just want that consistency. Once you've opened it, you need to think about finishing it off soon, because eventually you're going to have more and more oxygen interacting.
Going into it. Yeah. I'd love to know how important the whiskey industry is to Scotland. You may not know the answer to this question, but what percentage of Scotland's exports does whiskey represent? So
according to the Scotch Whisky Association, it was around 26% last year. So it's a very enormous,
absolutely enormous industry for Scotland,
really
isn't it?
Yeah, and for not just revenue, but employment as well, tourism, everything. Yeah.
Do you think whiskey is a better investment than wine?
Wow, you put me on the spot. I mean, personally, I have investments in both, so I spread it between both. I believe that we're in a period now where there's a great growth story still ahead for whiskey. And I think, as I say, part of the reason why I pivoted more towards the whiskey side from the wine side was because more and more people were coming to me asking about whiskey. With wine, we had moments like Hong Kong opening up its wine market by zero rating tax. I can't predict that's going to happen for whiskey, but it just shows that there are many, many clients out there, many, many consumers that have yet to really tap into whiskey. India, mainland China are still, there's a lot of great whiskey collectors in there, but there's still a lot more that can be found. So I think there's a great story ahead of it, and that's why I'm personally putting my money where my mouth is.
Ross, I have to say, it's been such an education spending the last 45 minutes with you. Just getting an insight into the technicalities of the whiskey industry, and I can see that actually it's got a long way to go. Thank you very much indeed.
It's been great. Thanks so much, Algie. Cheers.
All content on the Algaes Investment Podcast is for your general information and use only, and is not intended to address your particular requirements. In particular, the content does not constitute any form of advice, recommendation, representation, endorsement, or arrangement, and is not intended to be relied upon by users in making or refraining from making any specific investment or other decisions. Guests and presenters may have positions in any of the investments discussed.